Hello kings, queens, and majesties, welcome to Whale Stat. I'm Slice of Otaku, and back when Xiao first released, he was actually my favorite character. My first favorite character at that. And so now that even more players have the opportunity to get a hold of the Vigilant Yaksha himself, I figure a character guide is in order. As usual with our guides, we will of course be taking a look at Xiao's talents, passive skills, optimal artifacts, weapons, constellations, and team compositions, all of which you can find timestamps for on the video and in the description below. So when it comes to Xiao's normal attack Whirlwind Thrust, this is to me a very fluid sequence of movements and probably one of the most satisfying polearm animations in the game. One that transitions really well into its oh so furious charge attack. And fluidity is great because it makes for better efficiency, and we are definitely going to want to make the most of our time with Xiao. Xiao has the highest plunge damage multipliers of any polearm user, and interestingly enough, regardless of altitude, Xiao's plunging attack will always nullify fall damage, which is pretty neat. Xiao's elemental skill, Lemniscatic Wind Cycling, causes Xiao to lunge forward, dealing animal damage along its linear pathway. At base, this talent has 2 charges and may be used in mid-air. Another interesting tidbit is that so long as Xiao is off the ground, regardless of his height from it, after using his elemental skill, he can perform a plunging attack from that point. Now for most, however, Xiao's elemental skill is merely a means to an end, as more importantly, we have his elemental burst, Bane of all evil. Now this talent is by far the most important aspect of Xiao's kit. Everything you do with the character will revolve around it. With it, Xiao puts on his Yaksha mask and commences his slaughter. With it, Xiao's ability to jump becomes unreal. Not only that, but his normal, charged, and plunging attacks receive an attack bonus ranging from 58.45% at level 1 to 108.85% at crown level 13. And each of these attacks has an increased area of effect to boot. Not only that, but Xiao's attack damage is converted to anemo damage, which cannot be overridden by any other elemental infusion. So for as insane as it would be, we can't make a Cryo Xiao with Chongyun or anything like that. This form only sticks around so long as Xiao himself is on the field, and lastly, during it, Xiao does actually lose a percentage of his health every second over the course of this 15-second duration. For talent levels 1 through 3, that is a reduction of 3% of Xiao's current health per second. From levels 4 through 6, the reduction becomes 2.5%. And from level 7 onwards, the reduction becomes 2% per second. Now initially this may come across as pretty damning, but generally it's not actually that bad. Again, we are talking about 2% of Xiao's current health, not his maximum health. With that being said, a reduction is a reduction, and so pairing this with incoming enemy damage may spell certain disaster if we're not too careful, and so that will be something to certainly bear in mind. Now, for the sake of truly making the most of these 15 seconds, which for a burst-induced stance change is actually a pretty long time considering characters like the Raiden Shogun are only in theirs for 7 seconds, we'll generally want to prioritize plunging damage above all else. As again, our modifiers there are pretty damn good, and with the height of Xiao's jumps during his burst, it is all too easy to accomplish. With that being said, you can certainly get by simply leaping into the air and dropping down, of course, and honestly, if I'm being lazy and not taking things all too seriously, that is what I'll end up doing. But if you really want to make the most of your time with Xiao's burst, you're going to want to incorporate 2 things into this sequence if applicable. The first being charge attacks and the second being plunge cancelling, the combination of which does improve Xiao's single target DPS by quite a respectable margin. And we'll see the best results with this when facing off against more formidable singular targets. That being said, when it comes to most mobs and the like, you're going to want to cut the charge attack portion out of your actions here, as the stagger of your plunges may move enemies out of your charge attack's range, leaving you to simply punch the air for quite a while there. But at the same time, there isn't really a situation where you won't want to plunge cancel. And doing that with Xiao is pretty simple. You're mostly just going to want to spam your jump as you are doing this. The moment you hit the ground, you're going to want to leap up again, and you're going to want to slam down before you hit the peak of your jump. We're pretty much small hopping here. But with this burst being so important to Xiao's damage, we will of course want to have it up as often as possible. In a perfect world with a duration of 15 seconds and a cooldown of 18 seconds, that leaves us with only 3 seconds of guaranteed wait time. However, the energy cost of Xiao's burst is 70, and with the cooldown of his skills charges being 10 seconds, we'll want at least a decent energy recharge rate, and some anemo battery assistance of some sort, but more on that once we get to artifacts and team comps. Moving on to his passive talents, we've got Conqueror of Evil, Tamer of Demons, which makes Xiao's elemental burst even better, as all damage dealt by Xiao during it is increased by 5% and increased by an additional 5% on top of that for every 3 seconds the ability remains active for a maximum damage bonus of 25%. So pretty much the longer we go on, the stronger our attacks become. And with this, especially towards the end of the duration, we won't want to miss any of our attacks as we would be wasting a whole lot of damage. After that, at Ascension 4, we have Dissolution Aeon, Heaven Fall. Using Xiao's elemental skill causes the damage of following ones to be increased by 15%. This lasts for 7 seconds with a maximum of 3 stacks. Gaining a new stack refreshes the duration of the effect. So yeah, each charge of the skill becomes stronger than the previous. Our talent priority here is going to be auto attack over everything else. This may sound a bit counterintuitive considering how much we raved about his elemental burst, but then again, his burst multiplies the damage of his basic attack, so raising that up definitely takes precedence. Then after that we get his burst up, and lastly we have his skill. However, if you're bold enough to get his Constellation 6, you may want to consider making his skill the highest priority, but more on that in a moment as we are moving on to Constellations. At Constellation 1, we have a very straightforward increase of 1 charge to Xiao's elemental skill. A very simple yet noticeable change, as again we'll want to be using his burst as often as possible, and this just makes that even easier to achieve. This also plays into that Ascension 4 passive we spoke about previously, allowing for even more damage, and gives us more wiggle room to maintain the bonus. At Constellation 2, we deal with Xiao's energy recharge a bit more, as while in the party and not on the field, Xiao's energy recharge is increased by 25%. But Xiao is a greedy boy, so he's probably gonna be on the field more times than not. Although one could argue that every little bit helps, making this a nice quality of life upgrade, which is why I opted to stop at Constellation 2 when Xiao first released. At Constellation 4, when Xiao's health falls below 50%, he gains a 100% defense bonus. What is probably one of the stupidest constellations in the game, and seriously not even worth discussing. But finally, with Constellation 6, things get pretty interesting. During Xiao's burst, hitting at least 2 opponents with his plunging attack immediately provides him with 1 charge of his elemental skill, and for the next second, he can use his elemental skill while ignoring its cooldown. Now, we'll talk more about that in a second, but first off, I just want to say that Xiao is really one of those 5 stars where you really do not need constellations. I mean, this is a case for all 5 stars, but seriously, you should never think you need any for this guy at all. My Xiao is C2, and although I don't regret getting his constellations at all, I'm pretty sure if I knew then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have gotten any. But with that being said, Xiao C6 is a different animal entirely. I'll never forget, I had been playing with Xiao for months and knew the character like the back of my hand. Then I saw his C6 in action for the very first time, and it was like a whole different character. Is it super optimal? Does it make him the most lethal DPS in the game? No, and hell no. But either way, if you're all about sticking to meta, you probably won't even be looking in Xiao's direction to begin with. Getting Constellation 6 for any 5-star is a costly endeavor for sure, and I don't suggest anyone subject themselves to that level of torment unless money isn't an issue in the slightest. I mean, just look at my Ito pulls if you don't believe me, but Constellation 6 Xiao looks absurdly fun and crazy satisfying, so I can't blame anyone for being interested at the very least. I know I am. But I also know all his other constellations are pretty underwhelming, so yeah. That's it for his constellations, however, now let's talk about his weapons. To kick things off, we have Xiao's signature weapon, the 5-star Primordial Jade Wing Spear. This thing has a substat of crit rate going up to a bonus of 22.1% at level 90. Its special ability being that on a hit, attack is increased by 3.2% for 6 seconds with a maximum of 7 stacks. And doing some basic math, that brings us to a maximum of 22.4% additional attack. But do bear in mind that this effect can only happen once every 0.3 seconds. But what's awesome is that when we do manage to gather 7 stacks, our damage is increased by a bonus 12%. Xiao is a greedy unit that wants to hog the spotlight as much as possible, so maintaining this bonus once you have it shouldn't be much of an issue. That being said, before going into your burst, you may want to get a few good hits in on your enemies to even make proper use of this ability. Otherwise, between your presumed 2 skill charges and several plunges, you'll only really be seeing the bonus damage towards the end of your burst. And since you're likely to momentarily swap characters once it's done, we end up just repeating an ugly cycle. That bonus to crit rate is really awesome to have and makes hitting and exceeding that 1 to 2 ratio that much easier. This is a great weapon. Another great 5-star on Xiao would have to be the ever universally good Staff of Homa. This thing has a substat of crit damage, and thanks to its passive ability, our HP is increased by 20%. We then gain an attack bonus based on 0.8% of Xiao's max HP. And if his HP is less than 50%, that attack bonus is then made to be 1.8% of his max HP. Easily one of the most fuel efficient weapons in the game, and totally worth grabbing anytime it comes around. With that being said, it's actually so good that plenty of other characters would love to have it, so at times in my case, I opt to hand it over to another character instead. In regards to 4-star weapons, we have some fantastic options as well. First up, there's Deathmatch with a substat of crit rate. If there are at least 2 enemies nearby, which is something Xiao excels against, mobs of enemies, both his attack and defense will be increased by 16%. But hey, if there is only 1 enemy nearby, attack is instead increased by 24%. At Refinement 5, with multiple enemies abound, attack and defense are increased by 32%, and if there is only 1 enemy, attack is instead increased by 48%. Continuing this flip-flop from crit rate to crit damage, we have Black Cliff Pole with a substat of crit damage. After defeating an enemy, attack is increased by 12% for 30 seconds for a maximum of 3 stacks with independent durations. Again, Xiao, despite his temperament, loves crowds, and that is a 36% attack bonus right there, which lasts a very long time. At Refinement 5, each of those stacks provides an attack bonus of 24%, which brings us to a maximum of 72%, which is downright insane. Crit necessities aside, for more consistency, go Deathmatch. But if you don't mind things being a bit more situational for higher yields, go with Black Cliff. Favonius Lance is an interesting option as well, and I'd say probably the fun pick of the bunch, as its substat is Energy Recharge. Crit hits have at base a 60% chance to generate a small amount of elemental particles, which generates 6 energy for the character once every 12 seconds, which is far better looking at Refinement 5, as crits are 100% guaranteed to generate 6 energy particles once every 6 seconds. This makes getting Xiao's burst up and running so much easier and far more frequent. If you don't mind losing out on a bunch of damage for the sake of being in his burst more, it's pretty interesting, and if I had the guy at C6, I might just mess around with this a whole lot in fact. But lastly, we have the oddball pick of sorts, Lithic Spear with a substat of attack percentage. For every character in the party from Liyue, the character with this weapon gains a 7% attack increase and a 3% crit rate increase. With 4 such characters on the team, we are looking at a 28% buff to attack and a 12% buff to crit rate. At Refinement 5, that is an 11% increase to attack and a 7% increase to crit rate per Liyue character for a max of 44% to attack and 28% to crit rate. Liyue has some fantastic characters that can pair with Xiao, but for most, limiting your team options may not be worth the trade-off, so yeah, oddball pick, but a choice all the same. Now let's talk about artifacts. For Xiao, you'll want 2-piece Viridescent and 2-piece Gladiators, or Shimenawa's Reminiscence instead of Gladiators since they have the same 2-piece benefit, whatever you have better stats for. For our Sands, because Xiao is very much a main DPS, we'll want a main stat of attack percentage. Maybe you're considering Energy Recharge instead for the sake of his burst, but that is a terrible idea. Please do not do that because you will be missing out on a whole lot of damage with that. For his Goblet, we have 2 choices, Animo Damage Bonus or Attack Percentage. And our choice between these two is majorly going to come down to substats here and the rest of our team. If your team already buffs attack a whole bunch, perhaps by way of Noblesse Oblige, their skills or anything like that, an Animo Goblet becomes a whole lot more appealing. In most cases, Animo Goblet will be for the best, but it's definitely worth gauging this for yourself on a case-to-case basis. I mean, I definitely switch things up depending on the team I am running him with. For his Circlet, you'll most definitely want either crit rate or crit damage, whatever you need more of. Because Xiao's Ascension stat is crit rate and you might be running Jade Spear or Deathmatch, you'll most likely be pretty set in the crit rate department. As for our substats, crit rate and crit damage take priority, followed by attack percentage and then energy recharge. When it comes to energy recharge, how much we'll really need will come down to our team composition, so more on that in a bit, but generally, somewhere between 120% and 140% is usually all you need, so please do not go overboard. Now with all that being said, Xiao is actually a bit of a weirdo, and I say this because really and truly, because of all the buffs to damage we get from Xiao's kit and potentially from other sources on our team, Xiao can be played pretty fine, great even, without any artifact sets in play. Ideally, you'll want the aforementioned set for sure, but if you don't have them, but have some good stats to play around with, surprisingly, it can work to great effect. But that's just about it for artifacts. Now let's move on to team compositions. Alright, so before we bring other characters on board, we need to define Xiao's role on any given team. Xiao is a hyper carry. We want him on field as much as possible, and during that time, we want him dealing as much damage as possible. To deal max damage, we'll need that burst of his available pretty much at all times, and for the sake of this, we will want quick rotations, plenty of energy, death prevention, and perhaps a bit of damage buffing. For the sake of our energy needs, we'll want an energy battery to feed our Xiao. My two personal favorites being Jean and Sucrose. In regards to Jean, we won't be holding her elemental skill, only pressing it to keep the ball rolling quickly. Once we do, we'll switch to Xiao, feeding him the particles and using his elemental skill charges if he is still hungry for more. Now Jean is fantastic because on top of being a battery, she is also a healer, which aids in our Xiao survivability. And since her healing comes by way of her elemental burst, it is a great idea to build her as a burst DPS. Giving her 4-piece Noblesse Oblige provides our Xiao with a 20% bonus to attack for 12 seconds, which covers the majority of his own burst duration. Alternatively, you may want to try using 4-piece Ocean Hued Clam instead, whatever works best for you. Now, if you have failed the 50-50 as much as I have and have Jean at Constellation 4 or beyond, oh boy are you in for a treat. And that's because while within the field of Jean's burst, all enemies have their animal resistance reduced by 40%, which just means utter carnage and mayhem for Xiao. With all that being the case, you'll probably want the higher end of our recommended energy recharge for Xiao, with it being around 140% or so. But perhaps even better than Jean in this context for most players, we have the 4-star Sucrose. Ideally, you'll want to have her at Constellation 1 for the sake of more properly garnering energy recharge for Xiao on account of her additional skill charge, but yeah, Sucrose is amazing. Her crowd control is crazy, allowing her to pull enemies in for Xiao to clean up. And she is a catalyst user, so we get our pick of either Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers or Prototype Amber. The first one being a massive attack buff of 48% at an easily obtained Refinement 5 for Xiao, and the other making energy accumulation even easier as it brings more particles into the equation. With Sucrose, you can be the most lax with Xiao's energy recharge needs. Oh, and this is another character we can strap 4-piece Noblesse Oblige on. Now, despite these amazing perks to having Sucrose with Xiao, besides the whole C4 thing, I personally prefer Jean a whole lot more, again, because of her healing. All it takes is one intense counter with Rift Hounds to make me really feel this way. Shielding is great and all, but when you're up against constant corrosion with a character that already has a self-flagellating burst, you're really gonna want a healer on the team. Early on when Xiao first released, I used Venti with him a whole lot, and again, he is still pretty great as a battery, but his burst pretty much ruins Xiao's burst time as it lifts enemies up too high in the air, so for me it is just not worth it. The Raiden Shogun is kind of like a universal team battery at this point, but she ends up compromising on one of the intended aspects of a good Xiao team, and that is field time. Xiao is a hyper carry, so that means no sharing the stage. With that in mind, we will want a sub DPS who can follow those rules and follow them well. Which brings us to my boy Albedo. Drop his Blossom and move on with your day. Plain and simple. Pair him with another Geo character as well, and we are looking at Geo Resonance, which is one of the best things a team like this can have. Especially a Xiao team, because with it, shielded characters benefit from a 15% increase to damage. And if you're wild enough to have gotten this guy to Constellation 4, while within the field of his Blossom, we are looking at a 30% bonus to plunge attack damage. Fischl is a great choice as well. If you have the 5-star LG for the end by any chance, that is another 20% buff to Xiao's attack right there. Otherwise, 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith is available to you, which again is an also reliable 20% buff to Xiao's attack. By now, I'm sure you can see how many ways there are to buff this guy's damage. Similarly to Albedo, we've got Geo Traveler, another character to throw a 4-piece Noblesse Oblige on. Fact of the matter being, if you can, why not have 4-piece Noblesse Oblige on the team? Although you should remember that the effect of this 4-piece set does not stack, so only have it on one teammate at a time. We've got a buffing healing pyro option in the form of Bennett, which may be paired with Xiangling for devastating effects, which at this point just about everyone should be well aware of on most teams. That being said, I personally don't enjoy the Xiao and Benny pairing just because plunging into what is effectively a bullseye isn't exactly enjoyable for me. Majorly because enemies just get pushed out of it. That and Xiangling can sometimes be a bit too greedy for my liking with Xiao, and with him being in the air so often, I don't really feel like I'm even making the most of her Pyronado. Now, battery aside, Zhongli is largely considered to be one of, if not Xiao's greatest teammates. I mean, after all, he did serve the dude for quite some time, so it does make sense that miHoYo would create some synergy there. Zhongli has access to 2 of the support artifacts we keep mentioning, Noblesse Oblige and Tenacity of the Millilith. His burst can petrify opponents, acting as a crowd control setup for Xiao, allowing for some unstaggered direct plunges. He keeps Xiao out of harm's way and prevents stagger, which would otherwise detract from our own mayhem. His shielding is very strong, the strongest in the game, and with proper investment is pretty much constant, making Georesonance really pay off for us. And to top it all off, while protected by his Jade Shield, the elemental resistance of nearby enemies is reduced by 20%. That's half of what Jean is able to do at Constellation 4. Good lord, is this a magnificent character to pair with Xiao, and honestly just in general. And while using Zhongli in this way, heavy HP investment is best, which is why I mentioned that Staff of Homa thing earlier, because for the sake of our purposes, he should be the one to wield it. Xiao, Jean, Albedo, and Zhongli make for perhaps Xiao's best team, but with that we are looking at a whale's paradise because that is a full-blown team of 5 stars. But of course we did mention a whole lot of potential characters we can mix and match with based on our availability. To add to that list, I quite like Diona as a mixed healer and shielder. Rosaria can also be a fun DPS who at Ascension 4 can add to our crit rate. Pair her with Diona and we are looking at Cryo Resonance for even more crit rate, at which point crit damage investment sounds even more favorable. Xiao is a greedy boy when it comes to his vengeance, but is more than worth playing as he can be a whole lot of fun. By the numbers, there are better DPS out there for sure, but there is no need to shackle ourselves to things like that in a game like Genshin Impact. If you're a Xiao haver or a Xiao wanter, hopefully this video serves to be helpful to you in some way. If it has been, go ahead and subscribe to Whalestat with notifications on, as there is plenty more where that came from. We have been preparing a whole lot on the back end to really make 2022 a special year for the channel, so your patience and enthusiasm thus far has been really appreciated, and hopefully you'll be happy to see what is to come. I've been your host, Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.